Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Delevan, and joining me, as always, is our producer, Chelsea Steer.
Hey, Sarah. To kick things off, I do want to give a shout out and a welcome to our newest subscribers to our YouTube channel. We want to thank them for subscribing. And if you have left a rating or review wherever you get the podcast, again, thank you, because it is the number one way that we get this show out to more founders just like you.
Yeah, and I love reading them. It's so awesome to hear what people have to say about the show. And every new subscriber, whether it's on Apple Podcasts or YouTube, is like a mini celebration happening over here to know that we're reaching more people. So yeah, thank you to all of you from me as well.
And Spotify. Don't forget Spotify. We love our Spotify listeners as well. Today, Sarah, I'm excited for the audience because they are getting to meet Sarah, the rule breaker.
Yeah, I don't break a lot of rules, but when a rule should be broken, I break it.
This episode came out of some listener questions and conversations that we were having inside the community. But that really led to me asking you a question around COGS.
Yeah. You brought such a great question to me. We decided to record it, turn it into an episode. You, from your time at Starbucks, where you spent a lot of time in management, were used to sort of looking at a P&L that was focused on certain industry standards. And it was really awesome to see your mind go like open and go, oh, there are other ways that books are kept. There are other industry standards. There are other ways that this is done. And that conversation very much led to this idea of talking about the various industry standards that there are, and the standards and also sort of the rules, quote unquote, of the industry that I break on a regular basis, and also the why behind that. So it was a really super fun episode to record. I'm excited for everybody to listen to it. But before we get to it, we have a somewhat exciting update, I'm going to say, to a news article that we covered in season 8 about the Kroger-Albertsons merger.
And Sarah, we're going to share a link to this article in the show notes for anybody that wants to, read the whole article for themselves. But essentially, the Federal Trade Commission and the state of Colorado have both separately filed lawsuits to stop the $25 billion Albertsons-Kroger merger, calling the proposed deal anti-competitive and anti-worker. So the Federal Trade Commission was actually joined by 9 different states' attorneys general in their lawsuit that they filed on Monday. And they've said that combining these two companies under one roof would create higher prices for shoppers and lower wages for workers.
Yeah. So rewinding a little bit, right? The big issue here with Kroger and Albertsons potentially becoming one corporation is that we've got 2 of the 4 largest grocery retailers in the country merging, right? That is an extreme level of consolidation of the food industry, which to me, and we talked about this, is harmful to everyone who eats food, right?
Yeah.
On the, as the FTC's suit talks about, they believe that there's going to be higher prices for consumers, not lower prices, as Kroger and Albertson argues. And as John Donnenberg, the deputy director for Biden's National Economic Council, says in the article, when large corporations are not checked by healthy competition, they too often do not pass cost savings on to consumers, and they exploit their workers. And this to me rings very true. What I foresee in the merger, as many, many people do, I'm certainly not alone in this, is that there's more buying power at the larger the retail business gets, which means driving down what they're paying to the brands that are supplying the store. Think Walmart. And a little foreshadowing of a great conversation coming up about the grocery industry that dives deeper into how Walmart operates and things. It's going to be fascinating for folks to listen to. But think about that, right? Now you've got that happening across more retailers as the consolidation gets greater and greater. So we're paying brands less money for their product, but there's no incentive to lower your prices whatsoever. right? And now you've got less retail employers in the industry. And so there's a lot less leverage for workers in grocery retail. Both of these things are extremely problematic.
Yeah. In fact, there's several local unions that are affiliated with the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, and they've released a statement applauding the FTC and saying that the acquisition would have damaged essential grocery workers' wages, benefits, and working conditions.
I mean, on the topic of, workers, right? The Colorado suit is really focused on this part of the problem. So the Colorado Attorney General alleged that Kroger and Albertsons had previously colluded to reduce workers' leverage in negotiating union contracts with the grocers. And the lawsuit cites emails in which an Albertsons executive told a counterpart at Kroger that his company would not poach Kroger workers while they were on strike, which is a move that could take pressure off of Kroger during the work stoppage.
Yeah, I find that incredibly interesting considering that Kroger has actually called the merger inherently pro-union.
Yeah.
Those two things don't really jive for me.
Yeah. And to take it a step further, the FTC, in regard to the Colorado case, said that a merger between the two companies would leave the combined Kroger Albertsons as the only unionized grocery employer in areas such as Denver.
Yeah, so that doesn't really leave them a lot of options to, fight back against unfair practices.
Exactly. So the good news here, Chels, is that these suits have been submitted. I don't know the legal terminology on it, but they've been put in place. They are at the very least slowing this merger and hopefully will help to stop it. So we're going to keep ourselves and all of our listeners updated on this as the situation progresses and as we get updates.
All right. So should we get to some rule breaking?
Yeah, let's do it.
Are you looking for support to tackle the financial work of growing or sustaining a profitable food business without hiring a consultant? Or maybe you want a different way to look at your food business financials. Now you can join Sarah Delevan for the weekly CFO office hours. Our setting allows you to get FaceTime with Sarah and a small group of your peers. Each week, the group will dive into the work that you're doing, support you when you're feeling stuck, and give you the confidence that you're on the path to profitability. Our March session starts this Thursday, March 7th, so this is your last chance to get your March office hours pass. Seating is limited, so be sure to get your pass now. Just visit thegoodfoodcfo.com and click on services. And now, back to the show. Sarah, last week, we had a question in our community around cash flow. Someone had listened back to episode 56 of the podcast, and they had some questions around cash flow and really what you were talking about in that episode, specifically, I think, around like margin.
Mm-hmm.
And you decided this was a great opportunity to go live in the community and have the conversation with anybody that wanted to join and answer questions. And it was a really great conversation, but there was something that I really zeroed in on in that conversation that I wanted to dive deeper into today. And it's around COGS.
Okay.
I was reading the chat of the live and listening to people's questions, and I started to notice that there were multiple different people using the term COGS in different ways. And I kept thinking, that's not actually what COGS means, right? COGS, cost of goods sold. And I brought that up to you, but then you actually even corrected me on how to think about COGS. And I thought it was so interesting because coming from like my background of running a business, but that business is actually owned by a big corporation, right? I, had to manage my P&L, manage my costs, right? But never had to dealt with sending the money out,
Right.
right, to purchase those things. And so my understanding of COGS really was a line on my P&L that showed me exactly how much money was spent to produce the products that we sold.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing more, nothing less. And so when I brought that up to you, you were like, wait a second, that's not exactly how we should be thinking about it. So I just wanted to dive in and talk about it a little bit.
Yeah. I'm excited to do this. And I think it's so great, that we had the conversation in the community on one topic, which really brought about sort of a need or an understanding that there's a need to dive into a related topic. And I appreciate that you brought it to me, prior to deciding to record this. You know what I mean? Because it helps me to understand, like, where are there holes in the things that we're talking about. And after being in the industry for this many years, sometimes I can take for granted that, like, oh, this is a concept that people feel good about and, like, we're all on the same page about, and we're not. And that's what we're here for, right? Is to, like, try to get us all on the same page. So I think we start with COGS, which is cost of goods sold. That is what it stands for. And as you described on your P&L and the business that you used to work within, cost of goods sold was just that, the cost of the goods that you sold. But for many people, many founders, especially of small businesses, on their P&L, what is labeled as COGS is actually all the money they spent on ingredients, packaging, and production labor, possibly shipping, merchant fees, right? It's all of those things that they spent money on in the month, regardless of how many units they sold. And that was the moment where you were like, wait, what?
Yeah. Yeah.
And the reason here is because there are two different ways that you can create a profit and loss statement. Two different methods, I should say, that you can utilize. One is called accrual-based accounting, and the other is called cash-based accounting. So what you described, where you're truly seeing the cost of only the items that you sold in that month on your P&L, that's accrual. Where you see the full amount, like if I spend $1,000 on flour this month, but I only used $500 worth of that flour this month for the products that I actually sold, and I have $500 left in inventory, in cash-based accounting, that full $1,000 is going to hit the P&L, not
Yeah.
just the value of what I actually used.
And so this is where I think it can get a little confusing, because I know that you talk about utilizing or like knowing your COGS in terms of pricing your product, ensuring that you have a healthy profit margin. And so in that space, you're really talking about like a unit, right?
Mm-hmm.
And not the whole business. And so I think that can get a little confusing for people. And I think we should take some time to really clarify
accrual-based accounting. And on your P&L, we're looking at just the cost of goods sold, that like for the items you actually sold, you're going to essentially be seeing your product margins there, right? It'll be like a blended margin.
Mm-hmm.
What you're not seeing there is the total amount of money that you might have spent on ingredients and packaging and other things that will eventually show up on your P&L there, right? And so you can look at that profit margin there and understand it, and that's important. It's going to be very similar to looking at your product margin. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Like they're
No, that
those,
totally makes sense.
okay, those two are very related. But it's not going to give you a picture of how cash is moving through your business, okay? If you have cash-based accounting, the margin that you see on your P&L is likely going to look quite different than your like unit margin calculations, because you might have just bought a pallet worth of jars, and that's expensive, right? And it's all going to show up on your P&L at one time. And so what is happening in that case is you're kind of getting a good picture of how cash is flowing in and out of your business, but you aren't seeing what I would call like your true product margins on that
Yeah.
P&L. And so that's why I suppose the answer to your question is you need to be looking at both all of the time. And if you're, again, on that accrual-based accounting, having a cash flow projection becomes extremely important for you so that you can see both that product margin and what it looks like in terms of how the cash is moving in and out of your business. On a cash-based accounting system, you get some insights into how cash is moving in and out of your business from that P&L, but it's still not going to give you the full picture, and a cash flow projection is going to be valuable in that instance as well.
And so then I also would imagine that in the cash-based accounting scenario, your essentially your gross profit margin is going to change from month to month.
Yeah. And that will be true. And here's another element to add to the conversation. That will be true that it will fluctuate month to month unless you are working with a bookkeeper and have a system to count your inventory on hand and make an adjustment to your finances monthly. So let's say, for example, you bought a pallet worth of jars. You might see that expense hit your P&L right for the month. And so if you checked your P&L, on the 15th, you'd have this big expense there. But then on the 31st or the 30th of the month, you go, okay, bookkeeper, I have 20,000 jars left that I didn't use. And they'll go, okay, the cost of those jars is X. And so we're removing that from your cost of goods sold on the P&L. Where it goes is onto the balance sheet. The balance sheet is where assets live, right? And so in accrual-based accounting, and stop me if I'm getting too far ahead here, but in accrual-based accounting, that's where your jars, your flour, your lids, your labels, all of those things that you haven't sold yet, they live on the balance sheet in an inventory account called either like raw materials assets or finished goods assets. And once those finished goods actually sell, sort of behind the scenes, when that sale happens, the unit of product moves from the balance sheet over to the P&L, and it shows up as that cost of goods sold.
Okay, so I think I'm with you. What you're saying is that in an accrual-based accounting situation, that those assets kind of always live off page
Yep.
on the balance sheet. And then in a cash-based accounting system, that's something that your bookkeeper can do for you at the end of the month, sort of, right? To like make that adjustment.
Correct.
But that
So
it's always going to show up on your P&L to begin with.
exactly. And so
Okay.
people listening who have cash-based accounting might have that adjustment made monthly, and they might not. And it's fine either way. It's just good to know which version you are working in, first of all, we're working with, and then is that inventory adjustment happening or not, so that when you look at your P&L, you know what that gross profit margin represents, and you know what the total COGS spend represents as well.
And I love the way you kind of broke down for me, like how each of these different kind of ways of looking at your finances, right? Basically, like what do they give you? What view do they give you into the way cash is moving through your business?
Yeah. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay.
I want to make sure that everyone knows what goes into cost of goods sold, because I think, during the live in the chat, there were a couple of questions. One was a clarifying question. I think, some others were like, is this included? And so maybe we run through some of the examples that kind of popped up there. So I suppose you could call these my like rules for calculating cost of goods sold. I break some rules that some people have, and I do it for good reason, and I can talk about that in more detail if needed. But the primary cost of goods sold are going to be your ingredients, your packaging, and your production labor. And production labor means the people, right? And the money we're spending on people to produce your product. And if we get into the nitty gritty here, let's say, Chelsea, you're the manager of the kitchen, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm a line worker, let's say, or a chef or a whatever, right? You're paid a salary, and you get paid a salary no matter how many units we make. I'm paid hourly, and I get called into work. I work and I get paid based on how many like units we have to produce. My pay goes into production labor. Yours does not.
Okay.
Okay. Because yours is fixed. It is what it is. It is not variable based on how much we produce.
Yeah, I think I'm with you. And so, kind of what you're saying is like, for me as the manager, my salary really kind of lives in operating expenses.
Correct. Exactly.
And
Yep.
and there were some really good questions, I think, around this like idea of labor too. In the live, I know one person asked, like, what about the person who does the shipping?
Yeah. That was a great question. Okay. So I'm going to start that answer by sharing a rule that I break. So
Okay.
one of the rules that I break, and I don't know where this rule, what I'm calling a rule, came from. It doesn't make any sense to me, but it's commonly done by founders and in the industry, is including overhead like rent in your cost of goods sold. And so that
Mm.
philosophy essentially says, like, okay, if I pay $1,000 for rent a month, right? That $1,000 is going to go into my cost of goods sold. It's very confusing because it's like a moving target. If I produce 1,000 units in a singular month, 1 month, then there's $1 of overhead going into each unit that I've produced. If I produce 500 units in a different month, then there's $2 worth
Mhm.
of my rent going into each unit of product. I don't know how you properly price your product using that moving target, like including that moving target in there, which is why I keep units that I am producing affect how much I spend on this expense, right? So the number of units I produce is going to affect how much ingredients I buy. The number of units I produce is going to affect how many jars I buy. The number of units I produce is going to affect how much I have to spend on labor, right? Those things they change with how much you're producing, right? anything that I can't trace to kind of match my production levels, I don't consider a cost of goods sold. I think something to make sure we're super clear on is that there are product COGS and then there are other costs of goods sold. So currently, like up to this point in the episode, we've been talking about product COGS primarily, right? And those are those things I mentioned, the ingredients, the packaging, and the production labor. And those COGS are the ones that we use to determine the price and calculate our product gross profit margins. But when you're looking at your P&L, there are other things that will fall into the cost of goods sold category. And these will vary by business depending on the channels you sell into and just how your business is structured, right? One of those things could be something as simple as merchant fees. If your company pays merchant fees, you pay $25 for a product, right? Your customer might, and you don't get that full $25. A percentage of that goes to the merchant whose credit card processing you used, right? So someone who's processing credit cards or doing transactions on a website, there's that cost that's hitting the books. Some people keep that expense in operating and other people put it up into cost of goods sold. So it might appear in your COGS, right? Another, and shipping is a good example. We just talked about the individual who's shipping for a company and the fact that that won't be included in the product COGS, but shipping supplies and the cost of a shipping label, right? When you're sending that product to a customer, we do often include that in the cost of goods sold category on the P&L.
I think that you just made this even clearer for me when we're talking about product COGS versus other COGS, right? So your product COGS are the money that you spent to produce the product.
Exactly.
Right?
Yep.
And those are typically going to be fixed to the amount of units that you're creating. That is the number that you're saying people need to know in order to price their product appropriately.
Exactly.
Right? To get the margin that they want.
Yep.
Then when we talk about, because you're opening my mind with this whole cash-based accounting situation, right? Is then I'm looking at my P&L and there's the COGS section of my P&L, and that is going to include other COGS, right? And that is the cost essentially of, like, I don't want to say the cost of doing business, but like the cost of selling those goods.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
And one of the ways I try to describe it to people is like, when you sell a product, basically any additional expense that it takes to get that product, to your customer, like the selling process, right? Going back to that merchant fee and the shipping process, right? You might include in those other COGS the person you have in the shipping department, right? You could do that, but it is not a product COG. It is another, a business cost of goods sold, right? It's separate. You don't include those necessarily in the product COGS and to calculate your margin. Now, in my mind, I hear people saying, why wouldn't you do that? I'm like, don't you want to know that? You should absolutely be aware of them. And you need to know, right? So if there's a client right now who's preparing to sell their product online. They know what their core product COGS are, right? And now they know that we're going to have to add a box and ice packs, and we're going to have to ship in this, certain fashion. And so these additional costs of goods sold that my business will incur, plus the merchant fee, plus whatever else, might go into it, those all get factored into the sale price in that specific sales channel for sure. But you have to start with the simple cost of goods sold first. Don't just go immediately to the full in sales channel COG and don't include overhead and other types of things into that product cost of goods sold, because it makes things more difficult for you in the long run.
So don't include overhead in your COGS.
Yes, correct.
What other rules are we breaking?
I don't know if this is a rule per se, but oftentimes when I ask someone what their product COGS are, I get one number. And it's a total number for ingredients and packaging and labor. And I always ask to see those three COGS categories broken out separately. And I think that that's important because that allows us to see, kind of like I described in the $1 Million Deal episode, what element of our cost of goods sold is having the biggest impact on the total cost, right? Is it our labor? Is it our packaging? Is it our ingredients? And we keep, I'll call them the COGS elements, separate for all of our clients all of the time, whether they're broken out, top to bottom on a spreadsheet or left to right on a spreadsheet. We were just negotiating with a current co-packer, where we need to see more margin in a product for a brand. They are at their price ceiling. We cannot reduce the price. They're in the right channels, but we just need a little bit more margin in one of those channels. And as we were talking with the co-packer and really looking at what are our options here, something that stood out like a glaring, beacon was the packaging cost is so high for this product. And as it really kind of stood out because it was like just as much as all of the ingredients combined, right? And so
Oh,
it's,
wow.
yeah. And so we're thinking to ourselves now, it's like, okay, this is an opportunity. This is a place where we need to examine how we can modify the packaging while still being true to the brand and still, kind of giving the right message and maintaining the quality, but having it actually cost us less money. And so we wouldn't have seen that if we were just working with one lump number. And to extend on that, when I organize a P&L for a client, I always have labor COGS, ingredients and packaging can be lumped together there, but sometimes they're separate, on the P&L, because when we're analyzing the numbers month to month, we want to see where are those numbers at. You know what I mean? If our margins are changing, what is it that's creating that change? Is it the ingredients? Is it the packaging? Is it the labor, right? And so then we can act quickly to keep things on track or get things back on track. So visibility is what I would call it, of the
Yeah.
primary COGS elements.
I wanted to call it the breadcrumbs,
Mm,
right?
that's
These
great.
are your
Yeah.
breadcrumbs month to month to keep you
Mm-hmm.
back on track.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that's great. Okay. Anything else that we should be considering when we are calculating our COGS?
I think my last recommendation is really related to pricing. I am a big, big believer in knowing your cost of goods sold, obviously, for your product, but then pricing your product for every channel that you could go into and seeing what your margins are. And I think that
Mm,
this is a great exercise. And I'm echoing back to the episode with Jason from Deo Water, right? This is an exercise that he did, and he's able to say, okay, based on the current cost to produce my product and each of the breadcrumbs, right? Each of the elements. And now seeing the price point in each potential channel that I want to take my product into, I can see what the calculated margins are today. And I can see where my margin starts to fall below where I want or need it to be to reach my financial goals. And therefore, I have identified that a change of some kind is going to need to happen before I enter that channel. And I think that that is one of the most valuable things that you can do for your business. I think most people have the price of the channel that they're launching in, and then things just kind of happen from there.
yeah.
And it's when they get into some cash flow trouble, or the P&L is not matching the bank account, as a lot of people like to say, then they go, why is this happening? right? And then when they dig into their margins, they realize, oh, we're not getting nearly the margin that we need here. So I think, yeah, that's my final like kind of rule to break and recommendation around COGS, because even though it's related to pricing, it gives you a clear indication on when will my COGS really need to change and by how much to be able to grow the business or build the business in the way that I want to.
And then I would even go a step further and say, and is that viable?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I think that, we've talked about this before on the show. It's like a lot of this work, when you dig into it, it really is an investigation.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yep.
And I think anytime you can dig in and really get a full understanding of how your business is working for you,
Yeah.
right? It just continues to give you the power to make the decisions that will continue to work for you.
Yeah.
I guess is the best way to say that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I think that's so true. And it's exciting to see people, inside of our community, like digging into these questions and, messaging on social media and saying, hey, like I've heard you say this and now I'm thinking about it, and let's dig a little bit deeper here. And, we're here to serve, right? At the end of the day, that's what we want to do. And it's exciting to be able to do that and to dig into specific questions that people have. So, I encourage anyone listening, if you have additional questions about cost of goods sold, if there's something that we didn't hit on in this episode, let us know. Like, let us know what you want us to talk about. If there's a topic that maybe we've touched on lightly, or even did a deep dive into, and you still have lingering questions, message us. Let us know. Like, that is what we want to dig into and make sure that we're helping you to build financial confidence, right? It's one of our pillars. It's a big part of our mission.
Yeah. And I would even say too, like, I wouldn't want anyone to be afraid or feel like they can't ask a question because it's something they feel like they should know.
Totally.
Because this episode is a perfect example of I thought I knew and I didn't. And so it opened a door for us to have a deeper conversation and for me to learn some things, but also to revisit some things and to feel more confident. So yeah, there's no question too small. There's no concept too small for us to dive into.
Absolutely. If people are maybe listening for the first time, Chelsea, or they're new to the podcast, maybe they're not sure of all the places that they can reach out and ask those questions or make a suggestion for an episode topic, where can they do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are on Instagram at the Good Food CFO, all one word. You can DM us there, reach out to us there. We're also on LinkedIn at Sarah Delevan. And we have our email set up, support at thegoodfoodcfo.com. We monitor that inbox daily and are love to get questions there, love to start conversations there with our community members. And then they can also join us inside our online community by visiting thegoodfoodcfo.com.
Amazing. And Chelsea, as we wrap up here, I just want to say thank you to bringing your question to me after the live and for inspiring this episode.
You're so welcome. For more content like this and connection with other food founders and industry experts, join us inside the Good Food CFO community. Just visit thegoodfoodcfo.com/join to learn more.
Thank you for joining us here today. If you enjoyed this episode or found it helpful or inspiring in any way, please share it with your founder friends on social and rate and review the podcast wherever you listen. It's the #1 way to help good food founders find the show. We'll be back with a brand new episode next week.